All right, this will be a brief lecture on tort reform, and I'm not going to go into, again, a huge, lengthy discourse. Rather, I just want to talk to you for a couple of minutes about some issues related to tort reform and how you might think about them. And so let's just kind of spend a couple minutes thinking about it. Number one, tort reform, as we hear that phrase in political jargon, often refers to reform of medical malpractice types of regimes. And so when you hear tort reform, really oftentimes politically what you're talking about is the idea that somehow the tort system unfairly predisposes itself to harming medical providers and medical practitioners, and that the verdicts are out of control and runaway verdicts are the norm, and therefore something has to be done because malpractice insurance premiums are damaging and harming medical providers. Now, as is typically the case, there's evidence on both sides of this, and there's indications via research that both sides are right. Well, and of course we know both sides can't be correct on something like that. In my view, what that likely means is that neither side has really the upper hand on the idea of tort reform. I just sort of speaking personally from my own position as an attorney who's been engaged in tort type cases since 1995, basically, or even before that, really, since 1993. For the most part, what I've observed in our tort system is that it works reasonably well, and that cases that juries think are baloney usually get treated as baloney, and cases that jurors think are realistic and meaningful get treated as realistic and meaningful. And while, yes, juries can be bamboozled, and yes, there certainly are circumstances where certain kinds of tort cases may be suspicious or less than savory. Clearly, that's always going to be the case in a country where there is freedom to file lawsuits. The fact remains that on a practical sort of, rubber hits the road. How many more cliches can I come up with today? Rubber hits the road kind of meaningful system. Just as a practical matter, I've not observed the horrific results that are portrayed by those on the side of saying, well, the sky is falling and we need to get tort reform done immediately or everything's going to fall apart and be a disaster. That said, of course, one of the dangers of having freedom is that people will abuse it. And so you sort of have to have a balance there, I guess, right? And you have to think about the balance when you're talking about tort reform. Do we want a lot of freedom? So let me get my, lots of freedom over here, right? Or do we want lots of control over on this side? And which way do we want to go? And how do we want to balance it out? Do we want to say that you can't sue doctors except under these 8 circumstances? And do we want to limit people's access to the courts? We're going to talk about contingent fees later on in another lecture, and that's another facet of how this all works out. One of the other questions in tort reform's case or tort reform arguments is, well, do we limit punitive damages, for instance? And there are arguments, again, both for and against limiting punitive damages. Punitive damages, as you probably know, but if you don't, punitive damages are those damages that are often assessed when someone has done something really particularly egregious, is what it boils down to. And so we often will permit punitive damages in cases, for instance, in a car accident case where one of the participants is under the influence of some kind of intoxicating substance, and thereby it causes a car accident. Oftentimes we will permit the person who is injured by that person who used the intoxicating substances, we'll let the person who's injured obtain what are called punitive damages. And this is a form of what we it's similar in form to what we call private attorney general type arrangements, and that is we want people to pursue those who do bad things, and we do want that extra oomph, if you will, against those who do bad things, and so we permit punitive damages in some instances. Again, my experience and just as an observer and as a participant is that punitive damages are rarely given and by juries. And not only are they rarely given, but they're not usually outlandish. I mean, jurors kind of get a sense of whether the punishment fits the crime, so to speak. And quite frankly, in my experience over many years of trying juries and also being involved with attorneys who are working on jury trials, jurors try really hard, has been my experience. They try really hard to do the right thing. And so, uh, tort reform, I guess you can tell I lean towards the idea that, you know, tort reform is a general sort of mantra, is sort of political positioning and really doesn't mean a whole lot. Political reform on a very ground level idea, I'm not sure we really need it. I'm not sure that the system doesn't have corrective features in itself that seem to help balance out a lot of the concerns that so-called tort reform adherents want. That said, there are, and I'll end with this, there are states like West Virginia, for instance, where they have problems keeping people, OBGYNs, for instance, who are among the most sued medical practitioners, and you can see why. It's not for the OB, it's not for the it's for the OBG, the OB side of it, the obstetric side, right? It involves babies, and people get particularly upset and frustrated and angry when something goes wrong when it involves their newborn baby. I mean, and for obvious reasons. And so OB doctors tend to get sued a lot. Um, I don't know that you could say that they are more likely to commit malpractice. It's just my sense is that it's more likely a case where people are going to have emotions running high and are more intense, and it's easier for the attorneys to kind of go after an OB who has caused damage or death to a baby. That's just, it's just easier to pick on somebody for that. So, but there are some problems there that we do have to address. Whether tort reform is the way to address them, I don't know. Um, you'll be reading a little bit about it. You'll be telling me what you think, and I look forward to what you have to say.